Reverend Daniel Carter was a man admired by many. To the people of Pine Hill, Mississippi, he was more than just a preacher. He was a guide, a role model, and a symbol of faith. Every Sunday, families gathered in the grand white church at the center of town to hear his sermons. With his deep, commanding voice and gentle demeanor, he had a way of making every person feel seen and heard. His wife, Sarah Carter, stood beside him, always smiling, always the picture of a devoted preacher's wife. They were a couple people looked up to, the kind that others envied for their unshakable bond. But what the congregation didn't know was that Daniel was living a lie. It started small. A lingering glance, a touch that lasted just a little too long, a conversation that drifted into dangerous territory. Vanessa Reed had been part of the church choir since she was a teenager. At 27, she was young, beautiful, and full of life, her voice carrying through the church like an angel's hymn. She had admired Daniel for years, drawn to his confidence, his intelligence, and the way he spoke with conviction. When he first began giving her extra attention, she thought little of it. But then came the late-night text messages, the secret meetings after choir practice, the moments when he would pull her aside and whisper things she knew he shouldn't be saying. At first, she resisted. He was a married man, a preacher, someone who was supposed to uphold the word of God. But Daniel was persuasive. He told her his marriage was nothing more than an obligation, that he and Sarah had been distant for years. He painted himself as a man trapped, forced to stay in a loveless union for the sake of appearances. And Vanessa, young and desperate, to be loved, believed him. Their affair quickly escalated. What began as stolen glances in church became secret rendezvous in motel rooms just outside of town. In those moments, Daniel wasn't the preacher everyone respected. He was just a man, passionate and hungry for something forbidden. Vanessa fell deeply, hopelessly in love. She dreamed of a future where they could be together, where he would leave Sarah and they would start fresh somewhere new. Every time she asked when that day would come, Daniel reassured her. Soon, he promised. Just a little longer. But months passed, then a year, and nothing changed. Daniel still stood at the pulpit every Sunday, holding Sarah's hand, speaking of commitment and devotion. Vanessa started to feel like a secret, something he kept hidden away while he played the role of the perfect husband. Doubt crept in, turning love into resentment. She had given him everything. Her trust, her body, her heart. And yet, he continued to act as though she didn't exist outside of their stolen moments. Then, one evening, Vanessa overheard a conversation that shattered her world. Sarah was telling a friend about the upcoming vow renewal, a grand ceremony Daniel had planned to reaffirm their marriage. He had told Vanessa he was leaving his wife, but now he was making public declarations of his love for Sarah. That night, something inside Vanessa snapped. Vanessa couldn't believe what she had just heard. She stood frozen outside the church office, her heart pounding so hard she thought it might burst from her chest. Sarah's voice, filled with excitement, echoed in her mind. A vow renewal, a public celebration of their marriage. The very man who had sworn he would leave his wife, who had whispered promises of a future together, was now preparing to stand in front of the entire congregation and recommit himself to the woman he had claimed to no longer love. The weight of the betrayal hit her like a tidal wave, drowning her in a mixture of rage and heartbreak. She had given everything to Daniel, her love, her trust, her body. And for what? To be tossed aside like a meaningless fling while he continued living his perfect little life? She felt sick. The motel rooms, the whispered words, the late night confessions, they had all been lies, and she had been a fool to believe them. She stormed out of the church, gripping her phone so tightly her fingers ached. She needed to hear it from him. She needed to look him in the eye and force him to tell her the truth. Within minutes, she was outside his house, her hands trembling as she pounded on the door. Daniel answered, his face twisting in surprise at the sight of her. He stepped outside quickly, shutting the door behind him as if afraid Sarah might see. Before he could say anything, Vanessa demanded to know the truth. Was it true? Was he really renewing his vows with Sarah? For a moment he hesitated, as if searching for the right words. But his silence was all the confirmation she needed. The look on his face, the way his eyes darted away from hers. It was all Vanessa needed to know, that everything he had told her had been a lie. He tried to explain, to spin the same web of excuses. But Vanessa wasn't listening. The rage inside her boiled over, spilling out in harsh words and accusations. She reminded him of all the times he had told her Sarah meant nothing to him, all the times he had sworn that they would be together. And yet here he was, planning a grand ceremony to celebrate a marriage he had claimed was dead. Daniel, desperate to calm her down, reached for her hands, but she yanked them away. She saw the panic in his eyes, the realization that he had lost control of the situation. He told her he needed more time, that things were complicated, that he couldn't just leave Sarah without careful planning. But Vanessa had heard enough. She knew now that Daniel would never leave his wife. She had been nothing more than a distraction, something he had used to escape the mundane reality of his life. She turned on her heel and walked away, her vision blurred with tears. But as she drove home, something inside her shifted. The sadness, the heartbreak. It all gave way to something darker. If Daniel thought he could betray her and walk away unscathed, he was wrong. He had made her believe in a future that would never exist. And if she couldn't have him, no one else would. The day of the vow renewal arrived, and the church was filled with an air of celebration. White roses adorned the altar, soft candlelight flickered along the pews, and the choir stood, ready to sing hymns of devotion. Friends, family, and devoted church members took their seats, eager to witness Reverend Daniel Carter and his wife, Sarah, reaffirm their vows. To everyone in attendance, this was a beautiful display of love and commitment. To Vanessa, it was the ultimate betrayal. She had spent the past week consumed by rage. Every sleepless night, every moment spent replaying Daniel's lies in her mind, had only fueled the fire inside her. She had loved him. She had believed in him. And now, in front of everyone, he was going to humiliate her by pretending she had never existed. That wasn't something she could allow. As the ceremony began, Daniel stood at the altar, dressed in a crisp black suit, his Bible resting in his hands. Sarah, radiant in a flowing white gown, smiled lovingly at him, completely unaware of the storm brewing outside the church doors. The organ music filled the space as the congregation watched in admiration, believing they were witnessing a moment of pure devotion. Then, the doors at the back of the church creaked open. Heads turned as Vanessa entered, dressed in black, her face emotionless. A hush fell over the room as murmurs spread through the crowd. Some recognized her as a member of the choir, others as someone who had always been close to the preacher. But no one understood why she was there. She walked slowly, deliberately down the center aisle. Each step felt heavier than the last, but she never wavered. Daniel saw her now. His body stiffened, his eyes darting around as if searching for a way out. Sarah, confused, glanced between her husband and Vanessa, the pieces of the puzzle not yet forming in her mind. Vanessa reached into her purse, her fingers closing around cold steel. The weight of the gun was steady in her hand, unlike the storm raging in her chest. She had thought about this moment countless times. She had imagined confronting Daniel, making him understand the pain he had caused. But words wouldn't be enough. Before anyone could react, she raised the gun and pulled the trigger. The first shot rang out like a crack of thunder in the silent church. Daniel staggered backward, his hands clutching his chest, as dark red bloomed across his crisp white shirt. A gasp rippled through the crowd as screams erupted. Chaos followed. People diving for cover, rushing toward the exits, knocking over pews in their panic. Sarah barely had time to react before Vanessa fired again. The second bullet struck her, sending her crumbling to the altar beside her husband. The bouquet she had been holding slipped from her grasp. White petals scattered across the floor now, stained with blood. As the congregation screamed in horror, Vanessa stood motionless, watching as the man she had loved lay lifeless before her. The betrayal was over, but the consequences had only just begun. The church had become a scene of chaos. People screamed, some ran for the exits, others dropped to the floor, shielding themselves behind pews. The smell of gunpowder filled the air, mixing with the scent of roses and candle wax. The once sacred space was now tainted with blood. Daniel and Sarah lay motionless at the altar, their vow renewal ceremony ending in unimaginable horror. Vanessa stood frozen, the gun still clutched in her hand. Her ears rang from the gunshots, but she barely noticed the noise around her. Her eyes remained fixed on Daniel, his body sprawled out on the altar steps, his blood pooling beneath him. This was the man who had told her he loved her. The man who had promised her a future, but in the end he had only lied, just like all the others. The screaming grew louder. Somewhere in the distance, someone called 911. The sound of hurried footsteps echoed through the church as people ran outside, desperate to escape the nightmare unfolding before them. But Vanessa didn't move. She didn't even flinch when a woman collapsed nearby, sobbing uncontrollably, her cries blending with the chaos around her. She had imagined feeling satisfaction in this moment, the kind of justice that comes with taking back control. But now that it was done, there was nothing. No relief, no peace. Just an empty void that stretched wider with every passing second. The rage that had burned so fiercely inside her was gone, replaced by a cold, hollow silence. Then came the sound of sirens. The distant wail grew louder, flashing red and blue lights painting the stained glass windows of the church. Police cars screeched to a stop outside, doors flying open as officers rushed toward the building. Vanessa turned her head slightly, watching them enter with guns drawn, their voices commanding the panicked crowd to stay down. An officer spotted her immediately, his eyes locking onto the gun still clutched in her fingers. His voice was firm but controlled as he ordered her to drop the weapon. She didn't resist. Slowly, she opened her hand, letting the gun slip from her grasp and clatter onto the cold church floor. Within seconds, officers were on her, pulling, her arms behind her back, snapping handcuffs around her wrists. The cold steel bit into her skin, but she barely felt it. As they led her away, she caught one last glimpse of Daniel and Sarah, their bodies still intertwined where they had fallen. The whispers of the congregation followed her out of the church, their voices filled with shock, horror, and confusion. How had this happened? How had a woman they had seen in their own choir become a murderer? But Vanessa had no answers. There was no justification left to give. As she was placed into the back of a police car, the reality of what she had done settled in. She had destroyed everything. Not just Daniel's life, not just Sarah's, but her own. And there was no undoing it now. Vanessa sat in the cold, sterile police interrogation room, her wrists still bearing the red marks left by the handcuffs. The room was silent except for the ticking of the clock on the wall. Time moved slowly, each second stretching longer than the last. Her mind replayed the scene over and over. The gunshots, the screams, the sight of Daniel and Sarah crumpling to the floor. It felt unreal, like she was watching a nightmare unfold from outside her own body. But it was real, and there was no escaping it. Outside, the town of Pine Hill was in mourning. News of the church shooting spread like wildfire. People who had once admired Vanessa as a talented choir singer now spoke of her in hushed, horrified tones. Some called her a monster, a jealous woman consumed by rage. Others whispered about how Daniel had deceived her, how his broken promises had driven her to madness. But no amount of speculation could change what had happened. A preacher and his wife were dead, and Vanessa was the one who had pulled the trigger. Detectives entered the room, their faces stern but unreadable. One of them sat across from her, flipping open a file filled with evidence, crime scene photos, witness statements, even old text messages between her and Daniel that painted a clear picture of their affair. There was no denying it now, the affair, the obsession, the betrayal. It was all laid out before her like a tragic story with only one possible ending. The detective asked questions, but Vanessa barely heard them. Her mind was elsewhere, stuck in the past, in the moments before everything went wrong. She thought of Daniel's promises, the way he had held her and made her believe in a future that had never been real. She thought of the way he had looked at her in the church, the fear in his eyes when he realized she wasn't going to be ignored anymore. Was it guilt he had felt? Or was it just regret that his lies had caught up with him? Eventually she spoke. She admitted to the affair. She admitted to the lies. And she admitted to pulling the trigger. There was no use denying it. The evidence was overwhelming, and the entire town had been there to witness the horror firsthand. She had nothing left to fight for. The trial was swift. The prosecution painted her as a scorned woman who had let jealousy drive her to murder. The defense tried to argue that Daniel had manipulated her, used her, led her on with false promises. But the jury didn't care about the reasons. All they saw was the blood on the church floor, the lives lost, the betrayal turned to violence. Vanessa was sentenced to life in prison without parole. As she sat in her small gray cell, she realized that Daniel had broken his promise to her. But in the end, she had broken something far worse, herself. There was no love left, no revenge to satisfy. Just an empty existence in a place where time stretched endlessly. And the only thing she had left was regret.